study the laws of Edut, of witnesses from Maimonides. We're going to skip a little bit today, but just a little bit of a review. In general, in the first few chapters, we discussed the concept of testimony in general. Then Maimonides dedicated a few chapters to discuss the idea of a new form of witnesses, which is the form of a document where they don't actually come forth and explain or express and say what they're saying in person, but they sign a document. So we discussed that and how that was accepted by the rabbis, even though biblically speaking, at least according to Maimonides, that is insufficient. Then we spent a few chapters on discussing the process of how to authenticate a document. And that took some time because that's a big section. In other words, a lot of the commerce is based on documentation. So to figure out how to authenticate a document is indeed very relevant and critical for the functioning of the economy. Okay, then Maimonides now moves on to another discussion, which is who is accepted as a witness. And we're skipping a little to chapter. We're going to skip to chapter 15. We're not going to discuss at length, at least not today. We're not going to discuss the previous people class of people who are excluded. Maybe we'll get to that another time. In general, those are relatives. Relatives are excluded. That's derived from a verse in the Torah. And then there's something very interesting that's also derived from a verse in the Torah, and that is somebody who is considered to be wicked. The verse says, do not place your hand with the wicked to be a witness. In other words, if I see an event, I'm a witness to an event, but I need another witness. And it so happens to be that the guy standing next to me happens to be wicked. We'll talk about how you define wicked in a minute. But let's assume the guy next to me is wicked. So I am not allowed to join that wicked person together and form a group of two witnesses to testify. Because even though the actual story is true, I know the story to be true, but the witness is disqualified because he is quote unquote wicked. And that is the obligation upon me, the kosher witness, not to join forces with a wicked witness, but that teaches the general principle which is somebody who is wicked, it's not trustworthy. And how do you define wicked is that Maimonides discusses, but let's assume somebody who violates the law that everybody assumes that everybody accepts as the law, and a person violates that or is known to have committed a crime or is known to have lied in court. So there are all kinds of ways of defining wicked. But somebody who is wicked is not considered a kosher witness. Now, this is a little bit controversial simply because if you're a prosecutor, you want wicked people to testify because that's the way people investigate. They pressure the criminals to testify against other criminals. And that whole line of prosecution, at least from the biblical perspective, is not accepted because the foundational concept of why you believe witnesses is because you assume people are trustworthy. People have a chazaka. People have an assumption of innocence, an assumption of being trustworthy. But if you know that this person is not to be trusted, you know that for a fact. Why do you know that for a fact? Because you know that this person has committed a crime and this person is therefore not trustworthy. Then there's no logic to say that we can trust what that person says. Just because he was there, it doesn't mean that we trust him. So that is, we're not going to discuss that at great length today because we're not discussing those chapters. But these are the chapters that precede the chapter we're going to study. Now, again, if you're a prosecutor, you don't like this stuff. But if you are trying to figure out logically who can we trust and who could we not trust, this makes a sense, at least in my opinion. Okay, now we move on to something even more interesting. Another interesting concept. And this is as follows. I'm not a relative. If I'm a relative, I'm disqualified. I'm not a wicked person, at least not as far as I know. I didn't rob any banks. I didn't testify in court falsely. I didn't violate a law that everybody accepts as the law. So I'm an upstanding citizen. I'm trustworthy. The problem is I'm going to testify about something that ultimately will give me some benefit. In other words, down the line, I'm going to derive some benefit from my testimony. So the law, the principle that this chapter is going to discuss, this chapter and the next, I'm not going to study the next, but this chapter discusses is that if there's any testimony that I, the witness, will derive any benefit from, even if it's an indirect benefit, I am not allowed to, I'm not accepted as a witness. And we have a full chapter, actually 2 chapters, discussing this. And this opens up another whole line of discussion. So for example, I think I don't know the numbers, but I think over 90%, maybe 80%, over 80%, certainly maybe even over 90% of people in prison in the United States are in prison because of a plea bargain. So plea bargains have a lot of problems. It has a problem because of the wicked the wicked testimony. In other words, if you putting that aside, if I benefit from this testimony, if I benefit from this admission, if I benefit from what I'm about to say, then how can we trust what I'm about to say? So that's just a fascinating divergence from the Torah system to the system of the common system, the common law system, the American system, where the number one thing we need to protect against in the testimony of the witness or in the statement of anybody in this thing is the question. Number one question is who stands to benefit, and if I stand to benefit, then what I say has no consequence. So that's the question. The question is not who knows what happened. I mean, it's also who knows what happened, who was there. But the other question is who stands to benefit. And if I stand to benefit, then what I say cannot be accepted as a witness. I'm a fine person. We're not classifying me as wicked. We're not classifying me as a relative. Relative is not wicked, but we know relative is biblically precluded from being a witness. But we are saying is that if I have any sort of benefit from this, my testimony cannot be accepted. And this is, so we're going to start reading chapter 15, first and second section. In the beginning, Maimonides is referring to cases where it's a little controversial. Not everybody agrees. Later on, we see people, later commentators disagree with the Maimonides in some sense. But here's the principle. The principle is going to be, if there's a dispute between a member of the neighboring town and a member of my town, right? So they say our town owes them something or whatever it may be, then the witness cannot be from my town because the witness living in my town is going to benefit. So if there's a dispute, for example, about who owns a Torah scroll or who owns what are the examples here? Who owns the merchatz, the public bathhouse, etc. And there's a dispute between somebody in that, and between members of a different town and members of my town, and I'm in my town, and I testify that this item belongs to my town, they can't trust me because I stand to benefit. Because if it belongs to the people of my town, then I get to benefit indirectly from this item, and therefore from the testimony, and therefore I cannot be accepted. There is a way where I could try to separate myself and isolate myself from the benefit, and in that case, I could, in some cases, I could, depending on who you ask. So let's read a little bit. And so the beginning is going to be talking about cases where, excuse me, just 1 second. In the first cases, it's going to be, just 1 second, I apologize. In the first cases, it's going to be cases where I'm testifying on behalf of somebody in my own city. And in the second case, and the second series of cases, it's going to be about I'm a partner and I want to testify for the members of my partnership. So this is what we're dealing with. But again, the most important principle is the principle that states, Maimonides states immediately in the beginning, whenever a person will benefit from giving testimony, he may not give such a testimony, for it is as if he is testifying concerning himself, right? And it's it's an axiom that a person can't testify on his own behalf. Obviously, I am biased, or I am my own relative, depending on the different opinions, right? The Torah says, my relative can't testify on my behalf. So one of the things the Talmud says is a person is a relative for himself. If my brother can't testify against me because he's close to me, I certainly am closer to me than my brother is. So if I testify for something that I will receive benefit from, then I can't testify because that's testifying as if someone is concerning himself. So that's the general principle that's going to run through this entire chapter, as well as the next chapter. Therefore, when a person comes to the inhabitants of a city with a complaint concerning the public bathhouse or thoroughfare, none of the inhabitants of the city can testify regarding this matter, nor serve as a judge regarding this matter, until they undertake a contractual act removing themselves from any connection to the property in question. Afterwards, they may testify or serve as a judge. There is a way where a person could separate himself from the rest of the town. So let's say there's a dispute whether or not this public thoroughfare, this public highway, or this public bathhouse belongs to members of this town. So typically, I cannot be a witness or a judge because I stand to benefit. But if I make a contractual commitment that I will never use this bathhouse, I will never use this thoroughfare, then I could testify because we protect against the person receiving a benefit from the testimony. So that is one point. Now we're going to bring another example. This is a case where it's going to be a little bit more abstract benefit, and therefore it's not so simple to separate myself from that benefit. So let's see what Maimonides reads. He says, number 2, the following rules apply when a communal Torah scroll is stolen from the inhabitants of a city. Since it is intended to be listened to by all the members of the community, it is impossible for a person to withdraw his share of ownership from it. Hence, the matter should not be adjudicated by the judges of the city, and the inhabitants of the city may not testify to prove the city's ownership. Similar laws apply in all analogous situations. Maimonides seems to be saying that I can make a choice not to use the bathhouse, but if we have a synagogue and we all go to the synagogue together, and we all go to the synagogue together, and we all hear the Torah scroll being read together, then what am I going to say? I'm not going to listen to the Torah scroll. I have a religious obligation to, and therefore, in that case, I cannot be the judge or the witness, because essentially I can't separate myself from the benefits. Now, I'm just thinking now, if you ask me what happens if there are multiple synagogues in the city, and I don't go to that synagogue where this Torah scroll is being read, could I testify? My guess is probably yes, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to actually try to search the commentaries on this little section here. But in general, we see what Maimonides is trying to get at. So the Radvaz, other comments say as follows. They say, what happens if they're not talking about a case where I have different synagogues, but they're talking about a case where there are multiple Torah scrolls in every synagogue, in the synagogue. So what happens if the person says, well, I am a member of this city. The Torah scroll was stolen from my city, but I still want to be the judge or the witness. And the justification is I'm not really benefiting from this Torah scroll because we have other Torah scrolls. Say the commentaries on Maimonides that it's implied from the words of Maimonides that even if they have a different Torah scroll and even a better one, I guess better means a nicer one, nevertheless, a person can't separate himself from the benefit of the Torah scroll because sometimes they'll use the other one as well, and they're in the synagogue, so they'll be listening to the Torah scroll, and therefore they appear to be people who stand to benefits. So you get the idea. The idea is that even if I'm not benefiting directly, it doesn't belong to me. I'm not testifying about somebody owes me myself money. I'm just an individual as part of a city. But because my testimony is going to benefit the city, and I am a member of the city, so in a sense, I am part of the benefit of the city, so I am getting some benefit, even though it's not direct benefit, it's indirect benefit, but it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the collective. But if I am part of the collective, I too cannot be the judge, or not only the judge certainly, but I also cannot be the witness. That is number two. Okay, we have one more case about communal matters, and then we go to partnerships, and then we go to people buying and selling. So the same principle is going to play out in different cases. But now we have one more case about communal issues. So here's the case. The case is that somebody in his will, or not in his will, someone says, a philanthropist says, I want to give a certain amount of money to the poor people of this city. Now you need witnesses. Now that statement was disputed. So you need witnesses to testify that this person made that commitment. So now the question is, could the people from this city testify that this person pledged money to the poor people of this city? Now, I'm not poor. So what do I care that this philanthropist, why do I gain from the fact that this philanthropist promised charity to the members of this city, to the poor people of this city? I'm not getting direct benefit one way or the other. Says Maimonides, no, I am getting direct benefit. How so? Because the people of this city have an obligation to support the poor. So if this philanthropist gave money to support the poor, then my contribution, my tax, or my obligation to give charity is diminished. So I don't have to give as much. So therefore, I do benefit. So again, you see, this is even more removed. It's not that I am using the bathhouse or I'm benefiting from the Torah scroll. This is even less direct. I will have to give less charity because the poor people of this city are going to be gifted with a gift. Even so, I cannot testify because the pledge was to give to the members of this city, and I am a member of this city, even though I myself am not poor. So that's going to be the third section of chapter 15, and that's going to be the last section, which discusses the benefit that I get as part of a community. And then we're going to move to benefits I get as part of a partnership, or as simply to you'll see in other transactions that I do more that I do myself. So here we go. Number 3, when a person says, give a mana is a certain amount, it's 100 zuz, so it's 100 coins. So a person says, give a mana to poor people of my city. The matter may not be adjudicated by the judges of that city, and the inhabitants of that city may not testify to prove that the pledge was made. Why not? So the question is, why? The question is when or why. When does this apply? When the poor people depend upon them and they allocate charity to them. In such a situation, even if 2 members of the city promise, we will give the fixed amount required of us regardless. Let us testify. We do not hear their requests, for they receive benefit from the fact that these poor people become wealthier, for the poor are dependent on the inhabitants of the city. Similar laws apply in all analogous situations. So Maimonides seems to be saying, even if, let's say we tax the people and everybody gives $10 a year for charity. Okay. Now this wealthy guy comes in and says, I'm going to give 100 coins to charity. So my $10, I won't have to give my $10 pledge this year. Maimonides says even so then I can't testify because I'm benefiting now. I don't have to give my pledge. Says Maimonides, even if I promise that I'm going to give my pledge anyway. So in other words, I'm not going to save the $10 because I'm going to give the $10 anyway. Nevertheless, I am not allowed to be the judge or the witness. Why? Because I prefer that the poor people in this city will be wealthier, because in the future, we'll have to pay them less. We'll have to give them less charity. That's the idea here. Now, the commentaries point out that Maimonides was talking about a very specific social construct in the times of the Talmud, quoting the Talmud, where the people of the city felt an obligation to support the poor. So I'm reading now from a commentary on Maimonides called the Radvaz. I believe he was in the 16th century. And he says, if it's a scenario where the poor people are, the people are not, in other words, the people of the city do not feel obligated to support the poor people. And he says that, for example, he says in Jerusalem today, he was living in Jerusalem, apparently, that in Jerusalem today, where the poor people benefit not from the inhabitants of Jerusalem, because the inhabitants of Jerusalem, even those who were not poor, could not afford to support the poor. So the poor people of Jerusalem were not benefiting from the charity of the people of Jerusalem. The poor people of Jerusalem were benefiting from charity sent by communities from the diaspora. Okay, so if I'm living in Jerusalem and somebody says, I'm going to give 100 mana, 100 coins, 1 mana, 100 coins to the poor people of Jerusalem, says the Radvaz, in that case, the people of Jerusalem may in fact be the witnesses and may in fact be the judge to prove that that pledge has been made. And the reason for that is because they don't really, the people of the city, the people of the city don't really benefit from this pledge, because the poor people of Jerusalem are not being supported by the people of Jerusalem. They're being supported by the diaspora. So in other words, everything Maimonides is saying here is not necessarily set in stone. You don't have to look at this example as this is the law. These are, you have to take into consideration what is the scenario on the ground in that society, in that community. And if the people of the community stand to benefit from this charitable pledge because that somehow diminishes their charitable commitments, then they could not be witnesses or judges. Okay. What happens if you have land that belongs to two partners? Now, somebody comes and makes a claim, whatever the claim is, to extract the land from my partner. Either he says it's mortgaged, whatever the scenario. We'll talk about the scenarios later. So I am a partner with my fellow, and some other person wants to take this field away from my fellow, which means he's taking away the field from me as well. So the question is, I'm a partner, can I testify on behalf of my partner against the plaintiff who is making a claim against my partner? So in other words, it's not a question about me. So for example, let's say my partner buys this field and then comes to me and sells me 50% of that field. So now I'm partners with my partner in this field. But then somebody else comes and says, and questions that original sale, and says that my partner who bought it, it was not a legitimate sale, and therefore it belongs to the plaintiff, not to my partner, right? So it's not a claim against me, it's a claim against my partner. Says Maimonides, I am not allowed to testify on behalf of my partner. Why? Because then it's a case that I will benefit from. If my partner keeps it, then I keep 50%. And then Maimonides spells out that there is a way where I could testify on behalf of my partner, and but I have to protect myself again. In other words, isolate myself from any benefit from this field, as he will explain. So here we go, in reading number 4. The following rules apply when a person raises a protest. In other words, a plaintiff comes and protests and seeks to expropriate land that is owned by two partners from the possession of one of the partners. In other words, he says that other partner owes him money or whatever the case is, it's a question between the plaintiff and my partner, and I am a partner with my partner, so I want to testify against the plaintiff and for my partner. The other partner may not testify on behalf of his partner concerning the land, obviously, because if my partner keeps the land, then I benefit. And now we have, from here to the end of 4, we have the a way where where the partner could in fact testify on behalf of his fellow partner, but he's going to have to protect himself against deriving any benefit. So here we go. Unless he, meaning the partner who wants to testify, withdraws from ownership of the land and undertakes an act of a contract affirming that he gave his portion to his partner and committing himself to reimburse him for its value if his own creditor expropriates it from his partner. Okay, so let me explain what's happening here. First thing I have to do is, let's assume that me and Yankel are partners. And Yankel, there's a creditor, there's somebody coming to claim that Yankel owes, this field belongs to him, not to Yankel. Okay. So the first thing Maimonides says is I cannot testify on behalf of Yankel, because if Yankel keeps the field, then I keep the field. Okay. What happens if I really want to testify? I really like Yankel, and I don't want Yankel to take a loss. So the first thing I have to do is I have to make a contractual act, and I commit. The field no longer belongs to me, it belongs to Yankel. So I used to be a partner, I'm no longer a partner. If I'm no longer a partner, that's the first step in separating myself from receiving any benefit from this partnership. That's step number 1. But that's the easy step. But that's not the entire step. Why is not that the entire step? Because what happens if I claim, okay, it's no longer mine, I'm giving it now to Yankel. Okay. But what happens if I borrowed money in the past? And when I borrow money, we didn't discuss it. When I borrow money, we didn't discuss it yet, but this is a very important principle in Jewish law. When I borrow money, all my real property is mortgaged as security to protect this loan. So for example, if I borrow money and I own a house, and I say I'm borrowing money, I'm borrowing $100, I'll pay you back in 10 years. In 5 years, I sell the house to somebody else. Then I can't pay back, and if I can't pay back my loan, then the creditor could come back and collect the land, even the land that I sold to, even if I sold it to somebody else in the meantime. Because when I sold the land, I sold land that was mortgaged to protect this loan, right? So before you buy land today, you just hire a title company to search the title. In Talmudic times, you have to search the title, but the title included any loan that was made, any loan that was documented, that was made. In other words, any loan with a document that was made is a lien on the house. So before you buy a house, you have to investigate, are there any liens on this house? So therefore, going back to our case, it's not enough for me to say, you know what, Yankel, it's your field, I don't want to have anything to do with this field, and therefore I'll testify on your behalf because I don't get any benefit. It's not enough. Why? Because it's possible that in the future, I won't be able to pay back a loan, and this land that used to be 50% mine was mortgaged to protect that loan. And then that person will want to come and collect ownership, will be able to collect ownership from this, collect payment from this land that Yankel has, provided that Yankel has it, provided it wasn't taken away from Yankel by Yankel's plaintiff. So this is what Maimonides says. Not only do I have to say the land belongs to Yankel, but I also have to say that if any of my creditors come and they'll want to collect the land from Yankel because it used to part of it used to belong to me, I will then reimburse Yankel with cash. And therefore, it makes no difference to me whether or not this land is within Yankel's possession or not in Yankel's possession, because this land will not be able to serve as payment for my creditor, because in other words, even if my creditor takes that land as payment, I'm gonna lose that money anyway because I'll be obligated to reimburse my friend Yankel. So I'm not sure I'm clarifying this enough. Maybe we'll read it inside and see if it makes sense. So please ask any questions if I'm not being clear. But even if you don't not following every twist and turn of the plot, but the general idea here is you see how much we have to go to make sure that there's not going to be any even indirect benefit from my testimony. And if there is even a potential theoretical distant benefit that I will receive from this testimony, my testimony is not accepted. Okay, we'll go to number 5, because number 5 is actually interesting. So a very common way of dealing with the fields and the agriculture in Talmudic times was something called the aris. Here they translate it as a sharecropper. The idea is I have a field, but I'm not interested in working the field because I don't want to deal with the labor, I don't want to deal with the management, I don't want to deal with it. So what do? I go to a sharecropper, I say, look, take my field, plant whatever you want to plant, you do all the work, you give me 30% of the produce, or whatever, 50%, or whatever the case is, you give me 30%, you give me a percentage of the produce and you keep the rest. And like this, the owner owns the land, the owner gets a share of the produce, the sharecropper gets a share of the produce for his benefit, and that's the payment for his labor, and it's win-win, and everybody lives happily ever after. Okay, now here comes an interesting case. What happens if I'm the owner and then I have a sharecropper? Then a plaintiff comes and says, Menachem doesn't own the land, Yankel owns the land. Okay, so I say, what do you mean I don't own the land? I own the land. I even have a witness. Who's my witness? My witness is my sharecropper. We've been doing business for 100 years. We've been doing business for 10 years. And the sharecropper knows that I own the land. Okay, Mr. Sharecropper. We bring him into town. We bring him into the court. We say that he's willing to testify that I, Menachem, own the land. But here we say 1 minute. We have to think about this for a second. If the sharecropper already did the work and the produce already grew, and the time for harvest is close. Now we say 1 second. Then the sharecropper stands to benefit. Why does the sharecropper stand to benefit? Because if the field is determined to be Menachem's field, to be my field, then the sharecropper is entitled to a certain percentage of the produce, which is what I promised him. But if it's not my field, and the field is going to be given to the plaintiff, then the sharecropper invested all his labor, invested all the work, and won't be able to recoup his percentage of the fruit. Why? Because the real owner of the field never made that agreement with him. Right? If I walk into your field, I don't ask you, and I plant, I can't come and say, I want a share of the crop. You have no business entering my field. So here the sharecropper, now it's a question. If there is produce in the field, the sharecropper is not allowed to testify. But if there's no produce in the field yet, in other words, if the sharecropper did not do the work yet, he's just a person that we do business with and we're about to do business with, or we have a contract with. In that case, the sharecropper would be believed because he does not stand to benefit. And then we're going to bring another example of a renter. Again, the point of these examples is to say that, again, that we're just bringing examples to expand our imagination. And we're trying to say, even if it's an indirect benefit, if it's all here to support the most important clause of sentence of this chapter, which is the first sentence, any benefit that a person would receive from this testimony, from his testimony, if he receives any testimony, his testimony is not accepted. Okay, number 5. This is what we said earlier. The following rules apply when a person protests in the ownership of the field. In other words, I own the field, and then somebody, a plaintiff, protests my ownership. If it contains produce, so in other words, there was a sharecropper and he planted and the produce grew and the produce has not yet been harvested and divided. If it contains produce, a sharecropper may not testify with regard to it. For the sharecropper wishes it to remain in the possession of the owner so that he will receive his portion of the crops. right? The sharecropper has an agreement with me, not with Yankel. So the sharecropper wants that it should be determined that the field belongs to me, to Menachem, not to the Yankel, not to the plaintiff. Why? Because otherwise he's not going to get any benefit. He invested all his time and his labor, and he planted and he grew, and he's not going to get any benefit because it's not Yankel's field. So the sharecropper wants Menachem to own the field, and therefore the sharecropper, if they're produce in the field, the sharecropper cannot testify on behalf of the owner. Now here's an interesting case. Similar case. This is a little more common. Not everybody has a field with a sharecropper, but a lot of people are landlords. So here's a very interesting case. You have a home. You own that home, and you have a tenant. And this tenant has been living in your apartment for years, or at least with different cases. The tenant is in your apartment. Somebody comes and says, "Hey, it's not your apartment." So I say it is my apartment. What's your proof? My tenant will testify. Again, how do you prove ownership of land is another whole discussion. We discussed it in the past. We'll get to it another time. But putting that discussion aside, my tenant is going to prove that I own the apartment. Okay, now it depends. If the tenant did not yet pay rent, he's got the rent money in his hand, and he says, "Look, I don't care who owns the apartment. If Menachem owns the apartment, I'll pay the rent to Menachem. If the plaintiff owns the apartment, I'll pay the rent to the owner." If that's the case, then you can accept the testimony of the tenant because he doesn't care. But what happens if the tenant already paid rent? Now he cannot testify. Why can't he testify that the landlord is the real owner? Because if the landlord is not the real owner, he's now going to have to pay the real owner for all the time that he was already in the apartment. It may have been 5 years, it may have been 10 years, it may have been 6 months. It doesn't matter. If you're living in my apartment without permission, you have to pay me. The fact that you paid someone else who you thought is the tenant, is the landowner, that doesn't mean you don't have to pay me. Now you'll have to go collect money from the person you believe to be the landlord, but that guy may be out of town, right? So it's not so easy to extract the money. So here is the case. The tenant can only testify on behalf of the landlord if the tenant has the rent money in his hand, and he says, "I don't care who's the owner. I'll pay the person I thought to be my landlord, or I'll pay the plaintiff. That doesn't bother me." In that case, he could testify for the landlord. But if he already paid, then then he cannot testify, because if it's established that the plaintiff is the landlord, not the person he paid the rent to, then he's going to have to pay rent again. And then he'll have to work to try to recoup the money from the landlord. But maybe that guy has no money. Maybe he has no assets. Maybe he can't collect from him. So that's, again, another scenario where the judges have to be very careful to determine and make sure that the person testifying does not get any benefit from his testimony. So I'm just going to read the second section of 5. And I don't think we'll get to 6 today because I want to conclude with a nice idea. Different rules apply. So I'm reading the second half of 5. Different rules apply with regard to a renter. If he brings the rent with him and says, "Let whoever is established as the owner of this field take this," right? He's got the cash. He has the rent money. And he says, whoever is established, whoever will be determined as the owner of this property, I'll pay rent to him. Then in that case, he may offer testimony because he doesn't care who's the owner. If, however, he already paid the rent to the owner of the field, he may not testify. For if the field is expropriated by the claimant, he would have to pay him rent for all the years he dwelled in it. Hence, he may not offer testimony. Similar laws apply in all analogous situations. Okay, that's the law. That's some of the examples. I didn't read all the examples, but now I want to get to a philosophical question and show that Maimonides, again, is codifying the Talmud, but Maimonides himself doesn't really explain exactly the reason. Actually, Maimonides does, but there are 2 possible ways of reading this Talmudic passage. And there is, so it's sort of a philosophical abstract question. So I'm going to present that abstract question and the 2 possible ways of answering that abstract question. And then what I'm going to do is going to show that abstract question, the philosophy of this law, will actually have real world effects on how you apply this law. So we're moving from the law to the philosophy of the law, and then from the philosophy of the law, we'll show how the early commentators of the Talmud debated this philosophical, seemingly abstract question. But then you will see how that abstract question actually affects the application of this law. So when we sit down, we theorize about these matters of the philosophy of the law. It's not just to keep ourselves busy, but there is what the Talmud calls a nafkamina. There is something that emerges. There is something that a conclusion that emerges, a practical, real-world conclusion that emerges from all the philosophical discussions. Okay, here is the philosophical discussion. You told me, in other words, the law is that a person may not testify about something that he was going to derive benefits. Okay. If I'm going to derive any benefit, I cannot testify. That's what we have been saying for the past 44 minutes. Okay. Hopefully at least that point we understood. You can't testify about something that you will derive benefit from. Okay. Why not? Why not? So there are two possible interpretations. And the early commentators, we call them the Rishonim, the early commentators, in other words, the people in the same general period of time as Maimonides. You see, after you have the Talmudic times. After the Talmud, you have the period, about 500 years after the Talmud, you have the period called Gaonim. That's the sages then were called Gaonim, the leaders were called Gaonim. Gaon means the genius. After the period of the geniuses, that ended in about the 11th century, then you have the period of what we call Rishonim, the early commentators. They include Rashi, Rambam, Ramban, Rashbam, who else is there? It's many, many more. Ritva, many, many more. These are the early commentators, and they lasted for approximately another 500 years until about the 16th century. And then the period from the 16th century till now is called the Acharonim, the later commentators. So you have the Talmudic times, you have the Gaonim, the geniuses, you have the Rishonim, the early commentators, and you have the Acharonim, the later commentators. So the early commentators that are spanning from about the 11th century till about the 15th century, they want to know what is the definition? Give me the exact reason why I cannot testify regarding something that I stand to benefit. So there are two possibilities. The easier possibility is we suspect that I'm going to lie. It's a suspicion. In other words, we think it's a logical reason. If you stand to benefit, then you have a reason to not to lie. To say that it belongs to you or the person you know. In other words, to testify according to one opinion that benefits you. So if you stand to benefit, we suspect you're going to lie, and if we suspect you're going to lie, we cannot accept your testimony. So that's what the early commentators call that chayshinan. We worry that there's going to be a lie. That's one reason. Maimonides does not say this reason. Other people say it. Maimonides does not say this. Maimonides says something else. He doesn't say it explicitly, but he alludes to it. Other people say it explicitly. Other people say, you're not a witness. The whole concept of a witness applies to somebody who is objective. You're not objective. If it's about yourself, you can't testify about yourself. The language of the early commentators is, there's no edus, there's no testimony. It's not that you're a witness, but we are afraid you're going to lie. You're not a witness. By definition, the definition of a witness is impartial. If you're partial, you're not a witness. Do we think you're going to lie? No, we don't think you're going to lie. You're just not a witness, that's all. Just like you can't be a witness about yourself. You can't be a witness about someone that you stand to benefit. It seems that Maimonides says that, because Maimonides in the beginning says, any person, whenever a person will benefit from giving testimony, he may not give that testimony. Why? He doesn't say, because we're afraid you're going to lie. What does Maimonides say in the second line? For it is as if he is testifying concerning himself. What does that mean? Say, we're afraid you're going to lie. No, we're not afraid you're going to lie. You're just not a witness. That's all. You're not a witness. So these are two theories of why I cannot testify regarding a matter where I stand to benefit. Theory number one, because we're afraid I'm going to lie. Theory number two is because, not that we're afraid you're going to lie. You could be a respected citizen. We think highly of you, but you're simply not a witness. You're not a witness because a witness, the definition of a witness is impartial, and you are partial. Okay. This is a theoretical discussion. Almost all the early commentators, somewhere or another, amongst their writing, make a statement that fits one of those two categories. Okay, fine. So the later categories and say, what's the difference? Who cares? Why are you wasting your time on a Tuesday morning? I know the sun is not shining, but I'm sure you have other things to do. You're sitting Tuesday morning. You know the law. I understand. You can't accept testimony from somebody who is partial, who stands to benefit. But what's the difference of the theoretical reason of whether or why I'm not allowed to testify about something that I stand to benefit? Either it's because we suspect that I'm going to lie, or because I'm just not a witness. Because the whole concept of a witness is an impartial witness. What's the difference? Who cares? The law stays the same. So the later commentators say, no, there's a very big difference. And probably many differences, but I'm going to say the most simplest one, the one I understand. What's the difference? Here is the difference, at least a possible difference. And this is very interesting because this gets you to think. What happens if I stand to benefit from my testimony? I stand to benefit from my testimony. The problem is that nobody knows this. The judges don't know it. The plaintiff doesn't know this. The defendant doesn't know it. Later on, the next chapter, Maimonides says, those judges have to investigate. And if they see any, they have to think and be very creative. And if they see any indirect benefit to any of these witnesses, they have to reject the testimony. So it sounds like it's the judge's problem. It's the judge's problem to figure this out. It's the plaintiff's problem to figure this out. I am a witness. I happen to know that my testimony will benefit me. Do I have to disclose that information? To answer that question will depend why I think which theory I take on why the witness testimony that benefits me is rejected. So if you think that the reason why why testimony that benefits the witness is rejected is because we're afraid that the person is lying, right? We're afraid. You can't accept the testimony of Menachem if Menachem benefits because maybe Menachem is lying. That's your problem. But if Menachem knows that I'm not lying, I don't have to worry about that, right? So the judge suspects that I'm lying. But if I know that I'm not lying, I can walk into court with a clear conscience and testify about something that benefits me, because the judge won't accept it if he knows it benefits me because the judge suspects that I'm lying. But if I know that I'm not lying, I could walk into court and make the testimony with a clear conscience. That's if you believe that the reason why you can't testify is because we're afraid you're going to lie. But if you believe, according to what it seems Maimonides is saying, but other people say it even more explicit, that if I stand to derive benefit, I'm not considered a witness, because a witness, the definition of a witness is someone who's impartial. In that case, if I am partial, I'm not allowed to walk into the court and testify, because the fact that I know that I'm saying the truth is irrelevant. I am not a witness. I don't have the qualifications to be a witness. Just like if I'm a relative and nobody knows that I'm a relative, I can't testify because the Torah says a relative is disqualified. So in this case too, the fact that I stand to benefit is not a question of am I lying or not. It's a question of I'm not defined as a witness. If I'm not defined as a witness, even if nobody knows that I stand to benefit, I cannot present myself as a witness. I must disclose that I am partial, and therefore I am not a witness. So again, to summarize this theoretical discussion of why a person cannot testify if he stands to benefit. Option number one is because we suspect he may be lying. Option number two, it's got nothing to do with suspicion of lying. It just has to do with you're not defined as a witness, because the definition of a witness is to be impartial. So that will depend, that theoretical debate will inform what we believe about the case of whether or not the person has to disclose his partiality. If you believe the reason why a partial witness is disqualified is because we suspect, the court suspects he may lie, then he himself does not have to disclose this problem if he knows he's not lying. But if the problem is that you're not defined as a witness because you're partial, and therefore, according to the Torah, you're not a witness, then you have no business presenting yourself as a witness. and therefore I have to disclose that I'm partial if I'm called to testify. So this is the story in short. We had the principle, we had the examples Maimonides brought, we have the theoretical, the two ways of studying the Talmud, of figuring out why, what's the logic of the law, and then we have what they call a nafka mina, a case where the theoretical discussion actually informs the practical law. So thank you for joining. I enjoyed this. I hope you did. I'm sorry for going over time. I hope to see you soon in good health. Tomorrow we're going to do at 10 o'clock, 10 to 10:45. We'll do the section of the prophets, the Haftarah of this week. Hope to see you either at that class or other classes in good health, and have a wonderful day. If anybody has any questions or any jokes or anything good to say, please go ahead. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.